The Ten Commandments were spoken by God directly to a congregation of people. They were also written by God on two tables of stone and handed over to Moses. What is fascinating is that this happened about 3,500 years ago, according to the timeline of the Bible. Now, of course, the timeline of the Bible is exactly the same timeline that people used a long time ago to create the calendar that we currently live in, right? And we count the days from a specific person who was born about 2,000 years ago. What is interesting is that according to secular historians, no alphabet existed 3,500 years ago, or 1,500 years before Christ. According to secular historians, those that do not believe in this book, even though they do use the calendar that is based on this book, according to them, the alphabet was created roughly about 1,000 years before Christ. In other words, 500 years after the events that I'm going to be talking about. Now, secular historians, they agree that all alphabets on earth come from Hebrew. They just simply do not agree that Hebrew existed that far back. I will discuss the alphabet another time. Today I'm going to be talking about the Ten Commandments as they are listed, and they were spoken, and they were written down, and then they were handed down to the people that came after Moses in the book of Exodus. They're also repeated multiple times, starting with the book of Deuteronomy, and then later on they're repeated by Jesus Christ, with the exception of one that I will discuss here in a little bit. So, the fact that those commandments were written down is noted multiple times. I'm just going to mention one or a few of those. Here's one that is in the book of Exodus after the fact. After he gave those commandments and he spoke them and he gave the two tables, or what we now call tablets of stone, to Moses. So this is in the book of Exodus, chapter 31, verse 18. And he gave unto Moses, when he had made an end of communing with him upon Mount Sinai, two tables of testimony, tables of stone written with the finger of God. So that's one of the times when it's explicitly stated that those commandments were written down on two tablets, or two tables as the King James Version has it, two tables of stone. There are at least 5 places in the books of Exodus and Deuteronomy where this is repeated. Here is another one. Not to burden you too much with this fact, but in the book of Deuteronomy, we have, and he declared unto you his covenant, which he commanded you to perform, even 10 commandments, and he wrote them upon two tables of stone. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 13. Then further in the following chapter, Deuteronomy number 5, these words the Lord spake unto all your assembly in the mount out of the midst of the fire, of the cloud, and of the thick darkness with a great voice, and he added no more. And he wrote them in two tables of stone and delivered them unto me. So this verse 22 in chapter 5 of Deuteronomy, it summarizes essentially what happened. First of all, it happened on Mount Sinai in the wilderness after they escaped Egypt. He wrote them on two tables of stone, handed them to Moses, and he also spoke them to the assembly. So this is the only instance in the Bible where God the Father, directly spoke to such a huge congregation of people. Typically what we see and what we hear is God revealing himself through dreams or individually speaking to people, but never in such a mass assembly in front of so many people. Now, what happened with the first set of tables is Moses got really upset at the assembly because as he was talking to God and God was delivering the commandments and the statutes to Moses, the people down there, they were partying And then when he got down there and found out what was going on, he got upset. So he broke those 2 tables of stone, those 2 tablets. So God made another set of tables of stone that he wrote those commandments on. And this is explained in the book of Deuteronomy in chapter 10, verse 4. And here's how that goes. And he wrote on the tables according to the first writing, the 10 commandments, which the Lord spake unto you in the mount out of the midst of the fire in the day of the assembly, and the Lord gave them unto me. So, the commandments themselves, as God spoke them and as God wrote them down on those 2 tables of stone, they are listed in the book of Exodus, specifically in chapter 20 of the book of Exodus. And I'm going to go over them one by one. I just want you to remember that these commandments are in order. They're in order of importance, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit more once I get through a few of them. So here's how the first one goes. This is number 1. I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. What is very clear in the King James Version is that this is an address that is addressed to an individual. As you can tell, 400-year-old English, it states specifically, I am the Lord thy God. So he is not the Lord, even though he's speaking to an assembly, he's not addressing them together, combined. He's addressing each and every one of them individually, just like he is addressing each and every one of us individually to this day. Now, what's interesting here is that if this address is personally to me, as we'll see later on, that this address applies to everyone, not just that was part of that assembly, but everyone afterwards, even though a lot of these people, they didn't survive, they didn't make it out of the wilderness. We'll find out later that this personal address applies to everyone. So he is specifically saying that he brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now, I don't know about you. I've personally never been to Egypt, nor do I have any desire to go to Egypt, nor have I ever been in bondage, except being thrown in jail a few times, which is neither here nor there. What bondage is he talking about here, and how did he free people out of bondage, right? So what sets people free? This is a recurring topic in the Bible, of course, and that is addressed further down the road by Jesus Christ himself. So from a Christian perspective, if you will, what sets you free is the truth, right? The truth sets you free. He explicitly states that the truth will set you free. Who is the truth? God is truth, right? So the truth will set you free. Of course, very consistent throughout the Bible that God is the truth and he will set you free. Now, where do we hear that? We hear that in the book of John, in chapter 14, in verse 6. What does Jesus tell Thomas in the book of John? So Christ says, Jesus saith unto him, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. So as you can tell, this personal address in the first commandment is that he is the Lord your God. There is no other. There is absolutely no other. He is the one that brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. He's the one that sets us free. What sets us free? The truth sets us free. And who is the truth? From a Christian perspective, that is Christ himself, right? So that is the first commandment. Let's go down to the second one. Now, again, remember, these are in order of importance. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me and keep my commandments. This is one of the commandments that is also deceivingly simplistic. So the first thing that you should note here is that God says, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. So a graven image is literally something, an image that is carved onto wood. People used to do that long time ago. Some Christian denominations still do that to this day, right? So he's saying, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Nor should you bow down thyself to them. So as much as this sounds simple, and as much as people think that this does not really happen anymore, or potentially it's used in a symbolic manner, right? People hang up images as a symbolism. What is actually more critical with this commandment is that our worship of other images does not stop with graven images. And that is explained thoroughly further down in the Bible. Now, we worship all kinds of stuff on earth, right? We worship politicians, we worship sports figures, we worship celebrities, we worship all kinds of people. More importantly, the worst type of worship, the most deceiving type of worship is self-worship, right? And I want to take you a little bit further down in the book of Deuteronomy, where Moses talks specifically about that. So this commandment, the second commandment, is the engine that drives the transgression of all the other commandments that follow. So in other words, this commandment talks about pride, right? Self-worship, and how we should avoid that. It is potentially, excluding the first commandment, it is probably the hardest commandment to obey. And you can see that in all types of people who claim belief in God, that they completely disobey that commandment. And I want to give you an example of where it's talked about specifically that type of self-worship, and where stuff that you actually have comes from. So this one is in the book of Deuteronomy, and that is in chapter 8, verses 11 through 18. And listen to what Moses tells people. He doesn't just specifically talk to those people who are going to end up dying in the wilderness. He's speaking directly to those who survived the wilderness. In other words, everyone else, right? Everyone else, including us. So listen to this one. Beware that thou forget not the Lord thy God in not keeping his commandments and his judgments and his statutes, which I command thee this day, lest when thou hast eaten and art full, and hast built goodly houses and dwelt therein, and when thy herds and thy flocks multiply, and thy silver and thy gold is multiplied, and all that thou hast is multiplied, then thy heart be lifted up, and thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt, from the house of bondage, who led thee through that great and terrible wilderness, wherein were fiery serpents and scorpions and drought, where there was no water, who brought thee forth water out of the rock of flint, who fed thee in the wilderness with manna, which thy fathers knew not, that he might humble thee, and that he might prove thee, to do thee good at thy latter end. And thou say in thine heart, my power and the might of mine hand hath gotten me this wealth. But thou shalt remember the Lord thy God, for it is he that giveth thee power to get wealth, that he may establish his covenant, which he sware unto thy fathers, as it is this day. You can see how this is extremely difficult to believe in, right? Number one is by far the hardest. Number two is right up there, because who that you know of that believes in God actually believes that everything that he gets is from him? Very, very few people, right? The vast majority of people attribute their wealth to their own skills, maybe to a politician that passed laws that assisted them, and so on and so on. Maybe their boss, maybe some other entity. But the vast majority of believers do not believe this piece right here. So, as you can tell, people back then had the exact same incentives in lives as we do now. What is he saying here? When thou have built thyself goodly houses, so really nice houses, right? And dwelt therein, when ye have eaten and are full, in other words, when you're well fed, when thy herds and thy flocks multiply. We're talking about animals here, right? Animals produce what? They produce food, they produce clothing, they produce shoes, right? And thy silver and thy gold is multiplied. Who doesn't want silver and gold even to this day, right? And thine heart is lifted up, right? Which means that you have become proud and you forget where your wealth comes from. That's the entire point of these few verses here. And thou forget the Lord thy God, which brought thee forth out of the land of Egypt. So this verse specifically here is talking about people that have never been to Egypt. They've never been in bondage, right? They're just simply living their lives, believing in God, long after these people who were addressed in this specific instance, because they died, right? They died because of their unbelief. That generation that God directly spoke the commandments to, only a few of them survived. The rest of them died. They never got to build any goodly houses. They never had their flocks and herds multiplied, right? So, again, this is repeated throughout the Bible. This is not just in the book of Deuteronomy. This is not just in the book of Exodus. Just as an example to give you, in the book of Daniel, we have King Nebuchadnezzar, to whom God reveals himself in a dream that Daniel interprets. Well, for a while, King Nebuchadnezzar, the wealthiest king of the kings in the ancient Middle East, and potentially forever, because that's what God tells him, he would be the greatest king. He was the head of gold in that statue that he had a dream of. King Nebuchadnezzar, for a little bit, believed in God, and he turned towards God, and then later on, he reverted back and he said, it's because I have built all of these armies and I have crushed these surrounding tribes, and therefore I am the one that is responsible for everything that I have. So God gives him a massive delusion, and this guy loses his mind for a season, right? So again, this theme is not something that is observed only in the book of Exodus. This is observed only in the book of Deuteronomy, or that is only part of the Ten Commandments. It is consistently noted throughout the Bible. So that was the second commandment, right? Here's the third one. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. Jesus Christ. Did this have to be so far up here? Right? I mean, that's another rough one. Depending on what language you speak, specifically in English, English is very prone to include a whole lot of what? Speaking the name of the Lord thy God in vain. It's part of profanity, curse words, all kinds of stuff. I personally grew up in a household where, oh my God, was kind of like good morning, right? And then when I grew up one day, I was thinking, well, who is this God? Everyone talks about him. I just don't know anything about him. So what this does is it dilutes the meaning and the power of God. That's why this is so high up in the list of commandments. It is not random. It is not random at all, right? So you kind of get the idea. Good Lord, you probably should get that idea. So here we go. Here's number 4. Number 4 is the commandment that actually got me extremely interested in the Ten Commandments a long time ago, because it shocked me. It shocked me, first of all, that it's even in there. It shocked me that it's so far up there. It just didn't make any sense at all. And I'll explain that here in a little bit. So here's number 4. And by the way, I'm reading this through and through. I'm not skipping any of the wording here. So here's how number 4 goes. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the 7th day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. So Sabbath means Saturday, okay? There's no way around that. Of course, this alludes very much directly to the six-day creation. God does not create commandments based on allegory. The six-day creation, according to this book that I'm reading, is not allegory. The six-day creation is literal. That's why he makes a commandment, the fourth commandment, based on that six-day creation. The Sabbath technically is Friday night, Friday sundown to Saturday sundown. So if you kind of get an idea, this commandment was both literal, but also, as we note later on in the New Testament, it is the only commandment that Jesus Christ does not directly quote. In fact, it is a little bit repurposed. And I'm just going to go into a little bit of detail on that one because, again, first of all, it is very interesting to me. Second of all, I think it's very important. And again, this is from a Christian standpoint. It is very important to understand why this commandment is so far up the list of the 10 commandments, right? Now, once again, this is a literal commandment and people obeyed that for a long time. They just literally shut down Friday evening, opened back up Saturday evening or potentially Sunday, the first day of the week, right? I personally prefer to rest throughout that time. It's fun for me to just shut it down on Friday afternoon, sundown, and then rest, and then start back up on Sunday. As it's explained further down in the New Testament, no day is holier than another. So therefore, people are to choose whatever day they want to rest. But the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. You have to understand that this commandment is given to us. It's for our own benefit. Rest is good for us, right? What's also incredibly interesting about this commandment is that it's not relational. So if you think about this, the first three commandments, right? The first three commandments are relational. They're relational to God, between humans and God, right? The remaining six commandments, they're relational to people, between people themselves, right? The murdering and the adultery and so on and so on. Now, this commandment is not relational to anyone. It's also very much transitional, right? So you go from relational commandments to God, between God and humans, to relational commandments between humans and humans. And you have one that is just literally, as Christ himself says, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. Now, having said that, this is the physical, literal interpretation of that. Further down in the New Testament, we encounter the allegorical interpretation of the Sabbath. And I want to talk about that for a little bit because, again, this is a critical part of this commandment. This is one that was not, as I said earlier, explicitly repeated by Christ. It is repurposed, and here is, and I'm going to follow in a chronological order what is written in the book of Psalms. So the book of Psalms is written by David. The vast majority of it is written by David. This specific psalm is written by David. David lived 300-400 years after Moses. So here is what David says, and then that is further explained in another book that is written another 1,000 years after David. So here's what David says in the book of Psalms. Unto whom I swear in my wrath that they should not enter into my rest. So David is describing what happened into the wilderness. He's saying those people, God swore to them that he's not going to let them into his rest, right? And that's why they died in that wilderness. They never made it out except for a few people. And this is explained further in the book of Hebrews that is written about 1,000 years after David lived by an unknown, anonymous author. So roughly about 2,000 years ago, someone wrote in the book of Hebrews, for if, and this name here is Jesus, but you have to remember that Jesus is the same name as Joshua. I know this one is a little bit hard to explain, but I will try my best here. For if Joshua, if Jesus, Yeshua, Joshua is the same name. The King James Version uses Jesus. The other ones use Joshua. For if Jesus had given them rest. So he's talking about Joshua, the son of Nun, one of the few people that survived out of that wilderness and went into the promised land. Just a few of them, the new generation with them. For if Joshua had given them rest, then would he not afterward have spoken of another day? Meaning David would have not spoken of another day. There remaineth therefore a rest to the people of God. For he that is entered into his rest, he also hath ceased from his own works, as God did from his. Let us labor therefore to enter into that rest, lest any man fall after the same example of unbelief. The one way we understand rest is whenever you work hard and you accomplish things, you rest peacefully. So this is where, when people die, comes the phrase resting in peace, right? So the resting in peace comes from Christianity. Who is going to rest in peace according to the author of the book of Hebrews, which was written slightly after, a few years after the death, resurrection of Jesus Christ? Who are those who are going to enter into God's rest? Who are going to rest in peace? The people who are going to rest in peace are those who labor, right? That's what this is talking about. He is just explaining why David wrote what David wrote about something that happened 300-400 years before that. These people didn't get rest, but there is a rest that's coming in the future. He's talking about death and what happens in the afterlife, right? So those who labor are going to rest. So what kind of labor are we talking about here, right? Are we talking about carpenters? Are we talking about lawyers? Are we talking about physicians, doctors? What are we talking about, right? What kind of labor is this talking about? It's absolutely not talking about that kind of labor. It's not talking about secular, worldly labor that earn us money, right? It's talking about another type of labor. So what should you do? What should you labor to get into that rest, right? That's the $1,000,000 question, $1,000,000-year question more, rather. I don't know, right? I don't know. That's for everyone to determine personally. This is a personal effort. It's a personal labor. I personally know exactly what I'm laboring for and what my labor is. But everyone is given different talents or different gifts. Everyone has different skills. This is very much the equivalent in faith, in Christianity, of finding a purpose in life that will eventually give you rest when you face God. So if you're a believer in God, hopefully at one point in your life, you're going to find out what that labor is, that it applies specifically to you because you have that skill that no one else does, right? That is what that labor is, and that is the labor that's going to give you rest. And then, of course, further down in the books of the New Testament, Paul explains very eloquently that we all are given something, and we all need that something to be a part of the body of that church, right? So if you think about a body, as he very eloquently explains, a body has an eye, a body has an arm, a body has a leg, and so on and so on. Some parts are made for honorable use and other parts are made for dishonorable use, but they are still part of that body, and God needs all of those parts to work together so that that church prospers and moves forward, right? That's the entire point of this, and that's what's going to give us rest. So it's up to you to determine what that labor is and what that work is. Once again, this is a fascinating commandment that is, again, explained many times. It is not easy to understand, but it is very thoroughly explained throughout the entire book. And again, I also strongly believe in physical rest, truly in the literal meaning of that word. So definitely do that as well. All right, let's just move on to number 5 here. Honor thy father and thy mother, that thy days may be long upon the land which the Lord thy God giveth thee. Further down in the book of Ephesians, this is repeated. Honor thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise. So this is a commandment that comes with a promise, right? Christ specifically addresses that commandment as well. Like I said, the only one that he does not explicitly address in the literal sense is the 4th commandment, and that is honoring the Sabbath day itself, the literal Sabbath day. This one is definitely mentioned. So I guess along with your diet and exercise and 150 vitamins every single day, if you want to live a long life, there you go. There you have it. All right, What about number 6? Thou shalt not kill. This one is also deceivingly simplistic. Killing begins somewhere, right? Murder, and specifically, this is referring to murder, right? Laying in wait to murder someone. Of course, I'm reading out of the King James Version. Thou shalt not kill is the wording, the exact wording. Let's see what Christ has to say about that further down in the book of Matthew. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you, that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whosoever shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the council, but whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. This has been debated for a long time. This has got nothing to do about claiming that someone is a fool. Of course, David, Solomon, Jesus Christ himself, they clearly state who are the fools in this world. It is a progression because murder begins somewhere with anger, right? And what he's saying is you will be in danger of the judgment, and then you will be in danger of the council. When you say raka means some sort of a rebellious fool or something like that. It's irrelevant. It's a word that it was used by these people back then that is just a literal translation. Ultimately, murder begins somewhere, right? It starts with anger. It progresses to hate. It eventually, in some instances, it results in murder. So Christ is very specific about this. It's not just randomly murdering someone. It starts somewhere, so you have to be careful of that. Do not let that progression escalate to the point of hate that ultimately may result in murder, right? All right, here we go. Number 7. This gets even more fun over here. Thou shalt not commit adultery. All right. Now, Christ also addresses this one because adultery also does not happen when someone is walking down the street and falls on top of another and then tries to get up a few times, and then there's the adultery, right? So what does Christ have to say about that? Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. It's a rough one. No comment over here, all right? But what I am going to comment on is that out of the entire book, out of the entire Bible, with all the murders, with all the theft, with all the fraud, there are three instances. Out of thousands of people, there are 3 instances of people who commit adultery. Number 1, of course, is God's favorite, and that is David, or God's beloved, as that's what his name means. David slept with a married woman and got her pregnant. He is explicitly called an adulterer, right? He committed adultery, not fornication. I want to emphasize that. He committed adultery. So he slept with a married woman. He was married himself to multiple wives and had multiple concubines, but the reason he committed adultery is because he slept with a married woman. The second person that is recorded in the Bible came about 1,000 years after him, during the time of Jesus Christ himself. His name is King Herod. King Herod was sleeping with his brother's wife, okay? He was also sleeping with a married woman. Therefore, John the Baptist reproved him for it, right? And ended up losing his head over that because his brother Herod's brother Philip, his wife, didn't like the fact that John the Baptist was railing on them. So she ended up eventually getting his head lopped off. But this is the second person that committed adultery. So once again, very consistent. Not cheating on his own wife, but doing what? Sleeping with his brother's wife, right? They were tetrarchs back in the day. They were just simply ruling a land. 4 of them were ruling a land. That's described in the book of Luke, if you would like to read about that in chapter 3. And then the third person that commits adultery didn't just commit adultery, she was caught in the act of adultery. So think about that. She was caught in the act of adultery. Not fornication, once again, because fornication has zero, and I mean zero, sexual context in the King James Version. That word doesn't even exist in the newer versions. I talked about that at length another time. Now, she was caught in the act of committing adultery. This is a very famous story where men brought her to Jesus, and then they asked him, what should we do with her? The law says we should stone her because she was caught in the act of committing adultery, right? And this is where famously and proverbially he drew the line in the sand, if you've ever heard of that phrase before. And then he told them, if any of you is without sin, cast the first stone, right? So they all disappear. And then he asked the woman, where are those who condemn you? And she says, they are gone, my Lord. And then he says, therefore I condemned you not, right? Either. So the vast majority of people, when they read this story, they automatically, for some reason, I think it's a contemporary delusion, they automatically assume that she was cheating on her husband. There is zero mention of husband, right? Zero mention of husband in that story. There is zero mention that she was ever married. So if I were to believe, and if I was a gambling man, I would 100% bet on the fact that she was doing exactly the same thing that David was doing and exactly the same thing that Herod was doing, right? She was just simply sleeping with a married man. That's really all she was doing if I were to believe in the consistency of this book, and I strongly believe in it, right? That's why, for example, when David sleeps with Bathsheba, Bathsheba is not found to be liable. She's not found to be guilty. Now, we don't know the specific circumstances. Maybe she dropped the soap 100 times. Who knows when he saw her bathing naked and went for her. It doesn't matter. But also the same thing with Philip's wife, the affair partner of King Herod. She was not, John the Baptist was not going after her. He was going after Herod. So very similar story here, right? We have a woman who was caught in the act of committing adultery. We are not told about who she was committing adultery with, right? This has got nothing to do with misogyny, as so many people assume. Well, the man is not at fault at all, right? It's not his fault. Quite on the contrary, right? This is extremely consistent. The blame falls on the party that is breaking. He's breaking the covenant of that person he's sleeping with, right? That's what's going on here. Very consistent. All right, so that's number 7. What's coming up? Number 8. Thou shalt not steal. Oof. Thou shalt not steal is also very simplistic in writing as it's written down, but it doesn't just end with stealing. It also goes to creating laws that benefit certain people over others, right? So if you think about, for example, the difference between what first world countries and third world countries. In third world countries, there's just simple theft through bribes, etc. In first world countries, what do? They create laws that benefit some, typically the wealthy, over others, typically the poor, right? Let's see what God has to say about that. This is in the book of Psalms through David. Shall the throne of iniquity have fellowship with thee, which frameth mischief by a law? 400-year-old English. I know you kind of get the idea, but thus shall the throne of iniquity, in other words, transgression, the throne of transgression, the throne of guilt and sin, shall it have fellowship with thee, which frameth mischief by a law? So when you frame mischief by a law, that just literally means that you create laws that cause what? Mischief, right? This good old word. Now, let's see what else is said on this topic. Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decree, and that write grievousness, which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. God is the God of the widows and of the fatherless. That is noted multiple times. So this is in the book of Isaiah. Now, once again, this is describing unfair laws, right? So what is God saying through the prophet Isaiah in chapter 10, verses 1 through 2? Woe unto them that decree unrighteous decrees, and that write grievousness which they have prescribed, to turn aside the needy from judgment, and to take away the right from the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless. So this is explicitly telling people, woe to you if you decree those unrighteous decree that turn aside judgment, right? The right judgment from people that benefits usually the wealthy at the expense of the poor of my people, that widows may be their prey, and that they may rob the fatherless, right? So this is very clear, very consistent throughout the entire book. Nothing new under the sun. All right. Number 9, thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbor. This is straight up lying. It's not just bearing false witness in front of a judge and jury. Straight up lying, right? Number 10, thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Covering the entire spectrum. Don't covet your neighbor's wife nor his ass, right? That's a good old King James version of it. Of course, that means donkey. So, this, of course, is the very basis of what is referred to in society as greed and envy, right? Ultimately, coveting is you want something that is not yours, usually belongs to your neighbor. In many times, it's literally your neighbor, right? Because they're closest to you. But also coveting your neighbor. Of course, the book very well defines neighbor as anybody on earth. So this is what drives greed. This is what drives envy. Of course, when you cover your neighbor's something or other, we can see how that could start wars here and there. We may have been witness in every generation of that, every generation that has ever lived, right? So these are the 10 commandments as they were written on 2 tablets of stone by God, by the finger of God. They were also spoken by God to an assembly of people that were just scared beyond their wits. And they told Moses, you go ahead and talk to God. We're going to go away. And then you come and tell us what he said, because we're going to die. I mean, they were scared. They were scared to death. Okay. So where does that leave us, right? We have the 10 commandments, which become the core, the very skeleton of all of the law and all of the commandments that follow. There's a whole lot of other statutes that follow that include literally what we would describe as business law, what to do if you accidentally come across the animal of your neighbor, right? I mean, just it gets in explicit detail over hundreds of pages. There are hundreds of laws and statutes and commandments. This is the very core of them. As you can tell, it is extraordinarily difficult to be perfect according to God, right? Now, thankfully, that's not what he wants of us. He is very much aware that we cannot simply be perfect, right? So what makes people righteous? Well, from a Christian standpoint, we have been told multiple times what makes people righteous. In other words, what makes us justified in front of God? Is it us obeying all of those commandments to the T, right? No. That doesn't mean we shouldn't try. That doesn't mean we should break those laws on purpose. But here's what Habakkuk has to say. He is a prophet that lived 600-700 years before Jesus Christ. What does he say? Behold, his soul which is lifted up is not upright in him, but the just shall live by his faith. So those that are justified live by their faith. We live, those of us who believe in God, from a Christian's perspective, those of us who believe in Jesus Christ, we live, not just now, we will forever live by our faith, right? Because we cannot meet that threshold. It is way too high. The only way that we can live is by our faith, right? And that is a merciful God, right? Because he could have exacted from us to live by those commandments now and forever, right? Instead, we live by our faith. What does Paul say further down in a letter to the Galatians? But that no man is justified by the law in the sight of God, it is evident, for the just shall live by faith. Right? So he literally quotes Habakkuk, and then, of course, Abraham also. His faith was attributed to him as righteousness. So therefore, this has been going on since the beginning. Since the beginning, God wants our faith and not our perfection. And it's a very interesting, as I'm a fan of Solomon. Solomon, of course, lived about 1,000 years before Christ. In the book of Ecclesiastes, there's a couple of verses that are extraordinarily interesting and have been debated for, obviously, thousands of years. And I wanted to read those to you. Be not righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Why shouldest thou destroy thyself? Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? In a typical Solomon fashion, he leaves a lot of questions unanswered. Of course, this could mean one way or another that try not to judge a whole lot of people. Do not be righteous over much, neither make thyself over wise. Don't think that you're so much wiser and righteous than everyone else just because you think that you obey those commandments, because you will destroy yourself. Be not over much wicked, neither be thou foolish. Why shouldest thou die before thy time? So he takes a very balanced approach to life, which I am a huge fan of. I think, having said that, one of the things that people miss in the entire conversation about the Ten Commandments is not so much that it reveals our flawed character, and that typically makes people self-conscious, even though this clearly states that we live by faith. What people miss about the Ten Commandments is that they reveal the character of God, right? They reveal the character of God. So, assuming you believe in this book, assuming you believe in this God, right? If he has made promises, would you want him to be anything other than perfect, right? You would not want him to be anything other than perfect, because then he wouldn't be able to keep those promises that he made to you. How else would someone keep promises if they bear false witness, if they're adulterers, right? You cannot keep any covenants if you do not share those qualifications. So, to me, those commandments reveal more about the character of God than anything else. And I think that's a point that people should not miss. Again, if you believe in another God, I definitely hope that he possesses those characteristics and that he's able to keep the promises that he gives you. I have faith that my God does possess these qualifications, these characteristics, and that he's going to be able to keep the promises that he has made over thousands of years, that are testified by hundreds of people, right? As it is today. So may God bless you. See you next time.